Charlie Rowley, former Tory special advisor during those 14 years, or some of them, he joins me to discuss this and some other aspects which we'll delve into. Charlie, welcome.
Good afternoon, Nick. Thanks for having me.
How is life as a former Conservative advisor in a Labour government? Are you in more demand or less demand these days?
Well, it's certainly less stressful.
Is that because you're not defending decisions?
I think that's partly true, and I think you can absolutely have more ability to form your own opinion, speak your own mind, and actually still be part of the conversation, where I think actually some political parties still have this inertia about sort of speaking out too much or too often not answering a question. So yeah. I think it's much more stress-free on this side.
Okay, let's see if I can up your stress levels then. Kemi Badenoch, we're going to be honest about mistakes we made. I'm tempted to say, so what? But actually, is this a good idea, just to do the mea culpa thing and say we were awful, please give us another chance, which is where it's going to lead to?
Well, I think it's necessary, and I think it is the right thing to do, but I think you're also right that I think you've got to acknowledge the mistakes, but over that 14-year period, I think clearly there were some achievements.
Education standards, which Labour is setting about ruining. We didn't really, you know that, you were in that department, weren't you?
Exactly. Well, I certainly worked for
Michael Gove,
Michael Gove, the Secretary of State, when he was for Education. I wasn't with him when he was at the Department for Education. That was just slightly before my time. I was still working for an MP in Hertfordshire in 11-14. So I know that part of the world quite well.
Okay,
But I think what the Conservative Party has never been able to really do, or has always been shy about, is talking up its achievements. It's a kind of party that gets on, just works hard, does the job, or that's how it portrays itself as, delivering on things and then moving on to the next thing. And I was having this conversation, funny enough, not so long ago with somebody else, where I think I couldn't remember whether it was Tony Blair's last conference speech, or I think it was Gordon Brown's in the Labour Party conference in 2009, I think, before the election, where despite all of the problems that the Labour Party had got itself into, whether it was Iraq, whether it was crashing the economy in 2008, the financial crash, he still went out there and talked about things like Sure Start Children's Centres, about pensioner credit. So they still had a mantra that excited an electorate, that still made you think, even if you were totally fed up after the 13 years of Labour and the infighting between Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, there was still something there in the back of the public's mind that, we might not like Gordon so much, he's a bit grumpy, but actually, Labour, they have got something to shout about. So there is the risk that Kemi does talk about the negatives and none of the positives, because let's not forget, there have been 3 general elections where the public were able to vote out the Conservatives, and they voted for them right up until 2019. So it couldn't have been bad for all of those 14 years.
No, look, that's a fair point. But if I think what's grating with me a little bit, and she uses this analogy, because she talks about, look, we've had our worst ever defeat. This is Kemi Badenoch, leader of the Conservatives. In order to be listened to again, it's important that we rebuild trust with the public. Well, and this is the analogy she uses. When you've had a breakup, I'm assuming this is like a personal relationship thing we're meant to identify with. You don't just carry on as if nothing's happened. You've got to show contrition, show you've learnt from your mistakes. And it's really important that the public know that the Conservative Party is under new leadership. It's not the same thing they kicked out in July. And I mean, is it that important? Because if ever I talk Conservative policies or politics to anyone, they're not interested, basically, because we're not going to be around for about 4 years. Is it better that she just quietly gets on rejigging the party rather than telling us all to trust her because she's not the same as the lot that came before?
Well, I think there are 2 things there. I mean, yes, of course, if you have a breakup, you've got to show a bit of contrition, but you've also got to show a new lease of life, and that includes a bit of hope, a bit of optimism about obviously doing things a bit differently if you've changed and you want to demonstrate that you've changed. So that's what she's got to do. So you've got to announce some is. I know there might be a bit of a hiatus over a couple of years, which was reported last week, I think, where she says she doesn't want to announce things too soon. But I think the problem that Kemi, I think, might have is that you can demonstrate you want to do politics differently by thinking things through and then being absolutely honest and straight with the public about how you're going to do those things differently. So whether that's going for growth. So in her speech yesterday, she talked about Brexit was, something that the Conservative Party talked up before having a plan for growth. That we didn't have a plan, we legislated for net zero in 2050 without working out how to do it. So having a change of thinking and approach to things as to how we're going to fix something before announcing it is probably not a bad idea.
Yes, but isn't she also letting a quality that's often been attributed to her, which is kind of a bit of a loose cannon, shooting from the hip? She kind of, in interviews, it's almost like she's thinking aloud, which is why she got into trouble when she started talking about maternity leave and reforming maternity pay, because it's like she's thinking aloud. It's not thought out. The triple lock pensions row, she kind of talks and suggests means testing and perhaps removing the triple lock are things that we should be prepared to have conversations about with. All that does is leave a great big open goal for the government and other opponents just to attack her and say they're going to get rid of the state pension. Crazy, surely.
Yes, I think there is clearly a case to look at pensions and pension reform. So, it is obviously a case that if you are maybe a very, very wealthy pensioner, both in terms of cash terms as well as assets or any other marker, that maybe that particular type of pensioner might not have needed.
But why float the idea without, tabling it as a consultation at the very least, or something?
Well, I think you're right. I think that's, it's all very well being part of the conversation or to try and generate news by throwing ideas out there, but you've got to be able to back them up. But the one thing that I would worry about is that even if you have the best policy in the world that fixes it all, that is straight talking, that is well thought through, that isn't promising anything that can't be delivered, there still has to be, despite the total rejection that the Tories got last summer, there has to be an element of hope, optimism and politics, because otherwise you end up doing what Theresa May ended up doing in 2017, which might have been the best plan for social care that's been come up with. It wasn't particularly popular, but it might have been the plan to actually fix what is currently still a crisis in this country. But obviously that was rejected and people were put off by that because they thought, well, that's a bit tough, or that sounds a bit hard. And so voters still, despite calling for hope and trust in politics, and they want to see politicians deliver on what they say they're going to do, you've still got to present a package that is appetising.
The truth is, though, the public don't trust politicians. I don't think, even if I probably had the most ardent reform supporter here in front of me, if I grilled them, they'd probably say, I love what they're saying. I really want to believe they're going to do it. But deep down, they probably think, oh, maybe they're just like the rest of the politicians and won't deliver. I don't know. What's the point of trying to earn the trust when no one really trusts politicians?
Well, it's a question of the trust in politics. More broadly, I think, and trust in the state. So you might not trust or believe Nigel Farage or Richard Tice or anyone that's in reform, but I think the reason why there's so much momentum at the minute behind them is because they're saying, it's a Westminster problem, or it's a civil service problem, or there's too much bureaucracy.
And do you agree with that? Because I think there's a lot of truth in that.
I do. And I think, look, I was very worried when I saw Yvette Cooper, I think, in the House of Commons the other day, deliver her statement on the grooming gangs scandal, for example, the rape gangs inquiries. This is a woman who has been in government before, in a Labour government. She's been Shadow Home Secretary. She's been chair of the Home Affairs Select Committee whilst she was in opposition. She should be perfectly placed to say to a government department, a department that was by one of the former Labour Home Secretaries, to say that it wasn't fit for purpose. It still clearly isn't. To not be able to capture the mood of the nation and say, look, there's clearly an issue in various different parts of the country. up to 50 towns and cities we're told about where there might be these grooming gangs, and how there's been a failure of the social services, of local authorities, of the police not investigating them properly. This calls for a real inquiry, and I'm taking the lead to do it. She seems to have been captured by the Home Office.
Do you subscribe to the theory, though, that actually it's not Labour are worried about such an inquiry because it would expose some of their own party members in councils up and down the country?
Well, inevitably it would. But I think that shouldn't be news to people, because there are the councils that were already investigated, whether that was Andy Burnham trying to have one in, or did have one in Greater Manchester, but he was calling for a national one because he couldn't compel the police by law to come and give evidence. And Greater Manchester, the authority, certainly in Rochdale way, I think he was looking at it, I think is obviously a Labour council. Oldham, Telford, these places we know have got local authorities that are led by Labour councillors, and that's where a lot of the problems lies. Now, a national inquiry could expose that there are councils up and down the country of whatever political colour where there are problems here, but we'll never know until you have such an inquiry.
OK, listen, last question for you. Kemi Badenoch's probably not had the best December a leader of the opposition would have liked. There's some suggestion, she might be getting her mojo a little bit now. I personally am not convinced by her at all. I wasn't convinced when she stood as the front runner. Do you think that by the end of this year, after what even she agrees are going to be very hard May local elections, she'll still be in place? Can she cut it as a leader of an opposition party seriously aspiring to government?
I think she will, because I think the one thing that the Tory party has to do is give Kemi time. Yes, of course, you can't just go out there and make speeches and and not be part of the national conversation. But the one thing that Kemi has got to do is stay true to herself as well. And it comes to the point that you were touching on about Kemi. She does shoot from the hip. Now that can be a negative, but Nigel shoots from the hip, and it can be a positive. So she's got to be herself. She's also got to attract a younger generation of people coming back to the Conservatives. If it's the case that after a year and a half that there's still no movement in the dial, then I think that's when people might start to get a bit jittery.
I think the few remaining Conservative MPs will always be looking over their shoulder at their seats, Charlie. You know that. I am certain of that. Thanks very much for joining us. Former Tory Special Advisor Charlie Rowley there on the, shall we say, the first big speech that Kemi Badenoch has made. Is apologising enough? Do you think it's an important start? Can it rebuild trust in the Conservatives? The only message I've got on this one, which kind of goes to my point that I don't think anyone's listening to the Conservatives, is basically the only way the Tories will ever gain my trust would be if they stand down in all seats at the next general election, where Reform came second in 2024. Michelle says in Worcestershire, this country needs Farage for PM.